Welcome to Chapter 6, Foundation, the Abba Foundation. And this is about the Father and holiness. And this is a critical and really a transformational chapter to so many people, because when we tend to think about who is God and what God's like, our first go-to tends to be holy. God is holy. And yet we have some mistaken notions about holiness is, especially what holiness is, especially because we're looking through the lens of God as a judge, a righteous judge, and he's so wired to want what's right and to hate what's wrong. And so tell us what just the basic idea, why do we have such an interesting, could we say messed up view about God as holy?
Sure. So when we tend to think about God the way we think about other concepts. So instead of letting who God is inform how we see other things, we start with how we see other things and then project that onto God. So when we think about sin, we always think in terms of behavior. So we think sin is doing these things that are wrong, and not sinning is doing all these things that are right, or abstaining from the wrong, doing what's right. So when we think about sin in behavioral terms, we think that God is interested in our behavior primarily. So we think of God's holiness as God being holy because he does all the right things and abstains from doing all the wrong things. Have you ever thought of God's holiness that way?
Well, no, I haven't. I really haven't thought of God like I could somehow judge whether he's doing the right thing or not.
It doesn't make sense, does it?
No. And so we come to this idea of sin as a target that we miss, the word hamartia. So if sin is missing the target, how are we missing the idea of what sin is?
So again, that's the problem. So it is that the Greek word for sin, hamartia, is missing the target. So we think, what is the target? But we disconnect it from who God is. So God is primarily love. And what we see in the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So now we have to go back to chapter 2 and we establish this foundation. When we see that the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is primarily a relationship of other-centered, overflowing, self-giving love, then we need to begin to understand holiness in terms of love. So we would say that holiness is not about behavior, it's about being whole. In fact, the word holy and the word whole and the word health all come from the same root. And so there's a sense in which being holy is about being whole, is being so whole in ourselves that then our behavior reflects that wholeness.
So what about like Matthew 5:48 that says, "Be ye perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect"?
Yeah,
that sounds very much like behavior stuff.
It does. And we usually read that verse and we see God like pointing the finger, like, you better be perfect because I am perfect. Instead of seeing what Jesus is saying is, your Father wants to make you whole. Your Father is coming alongside. He's going to take you by the hands. He's going to heal whatever's broken in you, and he's going to make you whole. So we go back to what we talked about in chapter 5. And the whole idea that salvation is not just Jesus forgiving us for our bad behavior, but Jesus coming to us in our brokenness and making us whole. So when we look at our bad behaviors and anything that we could consider sinful, let's assume that it's a behavioral thing, right? Why do we engage in those behaviors? We engage in those behaviors because there's something broken in us. There's something in us that is not whole. And when we are not whole, we look for ways to self-preserve. We look for ways that we can provide for ourselves, protect ourselves, look for our own interests. So what does Jesus say? Don't look to your own interests. Actually, Paul says that. Don't look to your own interests, but to the interest of others. We can only do that when we are whole. So we're talking about holiness when the key point is, when we think about holiness, don't think about behavior as the primary thing. Think about being whole. When you are whole, then your behavior will follow suit.
So if sin's not primarily behavior, but the reaction to a brokenness, a separation from God, then I'm throwing the problem scriptures at you. What about Philippians 2:12 and 13? I always grew up hearing my pastor say, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation. That sounds to me like behavioral stuff.
The problem is that we stop right there and we don't read the next verse. What does the very next verse say? Very next it says, for it is God himself who is all the while at work in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So the way that we work out our salvation is by inviting God to say, yes, God, come and work in me, change my heart, fix whatever's broken in me so that I desire, so that he fixes my will, so that my will be in tune with his will, my desires will be in line with his desires. And then he gives me the power to live it out. He gives me the power to do it. So we work out our salvation not by trying to work harder to be good people. In fact, what's interesting about that is that the more we try to be good people on our own, a lot of people try that and they try so hard, and find that they can never really meet God's expectation, what they think is God's expectation. They give up trying. So instead of asking God to come do something in them, they just throw up their hands in there and say, I can't do this. I'm not even going to try. And they end up walking away from God because they think God is impossible to please.
Yes.
As opposed to coming to God to say, I am throwing my hands up in the air to say, God, I can't make myself holy, but you can make me whole so that we can live out the fullness of life that God has for us.
Yeah, so you're going to see this chapter is a paradigm shift for you. And what we're doing is we're looking at how God is first and foremost relational in love. And then if we apply that to all the other misconceptions we've had about God, all things start falling together. Even we'll see the Old Testament, the law was never meant to bring us to wholeness. It was meant to show us that we couldn't get there on our own. We had to have a relationship with someone who loved us, who makes us whole. Enjoy chapter 6 and take your time through it and let the Holy Spirit really work in your heart.